Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Soybean Board.
Whether it's spring planting, fall harvesting, or just a drive across the state, soy biodiesel helps a diesel-powered engine operate in a demanding job. Soybean oil from Nebraska soybeans makes biodiesel a renewable fuel that's also environmentally responsible. The soybean checkoff plays a major role in supporting the use and availability of biodiesel. The Nebraska Soybean Board, growing opportunity from the ground up.
Market Journal, television for agricultural business decisions, is a presentation of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine, and major funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Soybean Board. The Soybean Checkoff, growing opportunity from the ground up.
Welcome to this week's edition of Market Journal. I'm Jeff Wilkerson. On this episode, Elaine Kub analyzes corn and soybean markets. Lauren Giesler looks at the possible benefits of foliar fungicide applications in soybeans. Jeff Bradshaw talks about high numbers of wheat stem sawflies in the Panhandle. And Dave Boxler discusses fly control in cattle and grasshopper prevalence. Elaine Kub is our marketing analyst this week. Since 1995, the only year to exceed current U.S. condition ratings for corn or soybeans this late in the season is 2004. Farmers across the country hit record corn yields that harvest, a number that now sits second all time. Soybeans that season also reached a new mark, yielding more than 42 bushels per acre for the first time in history. Today, old crop corn is sitting comfortably below $4 a bushel, and old crop soybeans are spending time above $12. We talked with Elaine after the close Thursday afternoon. You spent some time traveling around eastern Nebraska, Iowa, and South Dakota. What do you think the crop looks like there?
Well, it's absolutely beautiful everywhere. I mean, you could be nitpicky and say that there are areas, certainly in eastern South Dakota, where they had the flooding this spring. There's some uneven areas. Even in Iowa, there's uneven spots in fields, but that's more than made up for by the incredible yield potential of the good stuff. You know, I was looking, the USDA's good to excellent ratings. This is not necessarily record high, the number of fields that are considered good or excellent, but the proportion that are excellent, not just good or excellent, but specifically excellent, is very high. I mean, there's just nothing to say. We have a beautiful crop, going to have a lot of yield. And
expecting record yields in both corn and soybeans right now. Is there a point in this season where weather is not a concern and the trade feels like the crop has been made, at least at that point?
I mean, I feel like corn right now is getting into pollination. There's not a whole lot else that could go too much wrong for the corn crop. There's areas in the western corn belt that are perhaps getting dry that you might have some small amount of concern for soybeans, but we've seen soybeans do really well with worse years than this, so we're probably looking at record yields no matter what happens at this point.
The next potential weather rally would come frost or harvest problems?
Yeah, and you know, you hear people talking about that to wait for a weather rally for this early frost, but it's July still, technically. I think it's totally inappropriate to be even be talking about early frost yet, or certainly to be expecting the markets to be putting in risk premium about that yet.
So what should you be looking for if you still have corn in the bin, which the assumption I think generally is that there is still a decent amount of corn left in the bin?
Yeah, I think that at this point, selling corn is certainly not very appealing. Selling soybeans is probably not profitable. Depends on what your input costs were. It might be. So if you're willing to do it, and this is risky, certainly you don't have anything covered, rely on your crop insurance. If you have an 85% crop insurance coverage right now, you'd probably be looking at an indemnity payment just based on the price movement that has happened. But the other thing you can look forward to is fall. We may get an El Nino movement coming in that could have a wet harvest here in the U.S. that could get some sort of a bounce in the markets. But more importantly, it could spark a drought in South America. And then you'd have a real opportunity to have your stored grain being sold in December, January, February with some sort of a rally.
If you have enough storage left, right?
If you have enough storage left or are willing to put it in storage, yeah.
You spent a couple months in Brazil recently. What are their thoughts next year? Does it look like they're going to load up on soybean acres yet again?
It does, and the people that are selling them input costs, selling them seed, they're giving plans on that right now. they're definitely confirming that we're looking at another big soybean crop, abandoning more of the corn. They struggle to get the record corn yield. They have more disease pressure there. So certainly we're looking at another big soybean crop from them if they can avoid a drought or an El Nino effect.
Right, and the buyers, such as China, do they look willing to also buy from Brazil and keep playing that, we'll buy from the U.S. after that harvest, and then we'll wait until Brazil, and then we'll wait, kind of back and forth?
Well, the beauty right now is that China's been buying from the U.S., and it's because of the Brazil FOB prices at the port there are about 25 cents higher than we're seeing here. So the point is that Brazil's not overloaded. They're not trying to dump anything. They're being fairly conservative with what they're willing to sell, and that is bringing China to our door. And so that's a stabilizing factor in the markets. It's something that might keep you from being terribly bearish and seeing prices fall into the $9 something level. Maybe we're going to kind of bottom out here and coast along.
When you look to 2015, what would get either the investor or the farmer interested in selling at that price or a potential run there?
Yeah, investors are not bullish on grain of any kind, certainly not soybeans. They're net short in soybeans, which I think is probably a statistical arbitrage between soybeans and corn. We're seeing the November soybean contract at almost 3 times the price of the December corn, which is very, very unusual. So I think that might be part of that bearishness from the investors on soybeans. But the thing that would turn it around is if you got any sort of excitement in the outside markets, the dollar, oil, the stock market, nothing has really been happening there. So everybody's just on a status quo. And I think the commodity investors are waiting to see the effects of an El Nino. And other commodities might get their money first, your coffee, cocoa, things like that. But soybeans certainly and corn should also benefit from that if it develops.
Corn sitting comfortably below $4.
Yeah.
Any chance it reaches back above it?
Certainly there's a chance, but you'd need to have something major change. The better question is how low could it go? And for a while I thought that there was no good reason for it to keep dropping because you had significant demand from ethanol on the feeders, but they're not obligated to pay any more for corn than they have to, so I guess there's really no natural bottom. We don't have LDP prices
What
anymore.
about in soybeans? Is there a bottom there?
Again, nobody has to pay anything more than they have to. I think they just have the competition between the South American markets and the U.S. and what China is willing to pay.
Next week, Mike Briggs will give us his thoughts on cattle markets. Nebraska's soybean crop is in remarkable shape according to the latest USDA condition reports. 73% of the crop is rated in good to excellent categories, and only 7% is rated poor to very poor. Nearly a third of the state's soybeans are setting pods, 18 points ahead of the state's 5-year average. Earlier this week, we talked with UNL Extension plant pathologist Elaine Kub about the possible benefits of fungicide applications to soybeans at the R3 growth stage, a subject UNL researchers have been looking at for many years.
Well, we've been looking at fungicides, for over 10 years, really, and looking at it on the crop stage on, when the best time to apply is, what types of products, these sorts of things for a long time. And really with a lot of that data, what we see is that R3 time, which a lot of the crop's in right now.
And what does it show that at that R3 time an application would do or would give or might give to your soybeans?
Well, and that's the thing, I wish this was consistent that all the time it would return. It doesn't return all the time. But we do see that, state average in that 1.7 to 2 bushel per acre range for just the fungicide that would have a strobilurin fungicide as a component of it. A lot of products now are in combination, but we sure want to make sure we have a strobilurin in there. And with that, then a lot of times producers are putting the insecticide in. And in a lot of our studies, when we add the insecticide with it, it doesn't have to be an expensive one. We get that additional boost. Now, the only problem with that, we're not really in the IPM strategy when we're doing that, Jeff. So.
Right.
But it does seem to return if you put the fungicide on to add that insecticide with it in many cases.
And there's no correlations on locations or anything like that that leads you to a decision of why it makes a difference?
At one time we had a data set with over 52 different field sites and comparisons, and we couldn't draw any conclusions on if it was higher yield, low yield, certain soil types, environment, these types of things. We know that last year, overall, people didn't see much response from a fungicide. This year is quite different though. And in previous years, the range that we saw, I've seen everything from 0 to 10 bushel per acre for a fungicide application in small plot work. So there's just a big range out there, and those producers that are looking at it, I just encourage them to try it if they haven't. Many of our viewers are going to say that they've done this and they're seeing good success with it. Others may try it and not have the good results.
Right. How much should soybean price weigh into this as to whether or not you're going to get your money back out of it?
Oh, it's huge. You know, when we're looking at price, I mean, they have to decide what their risk is and then look at, you know, how much they're looking at return. I think you could safely say in that 2 bushel range for what you're going to get, you know, back in general. It may be more than that, just kind of depending on how it plays out. And again, I wish we had the data to say this is when it pays and this isn't. But, you know, in general, it seems to be a practice a lot of people like.
So those are the benefits, but certainly a drawback has to be some resistance pressures that we could pop up in some of these fields, no?
Well, we could have resistance, and I'll talk on the fungicide part. I know the entomologists are concerned with the insecticide as well. From the fungicide standpoint, though, I'm not quite as worried because we've got a lot of combination products, and most of the time right now our diseases are in pretty low severity or incidence. So, you know, the main ones that we see in our fields right now would be brown spot. I don't know if anyone out there is going to say, yeah, we were wiped out by brown spot, so we're concerned about resistance developing in that. It is a background one that's out there. And a lot of the products that are again being used, we've got multiple modes of action that are effective against that, so that's a resistance management tool. The other thing is we're also making those applications at very low severity, so that's another strategy to minimize the potential for resistance development. So overall, most of the times our Nebraska farmers are not looking at managing a disease with this fungicide, they're looking for that additional yield advantage. Now the other part of that is if they do have fields that they have one that has, you know, that yellowing canopy in the lower level with the brown spot activity, we do know that in our research that we would pick up additional yield in that compared to one that had, we used 10% as a threshold. So if you had over 10% in the canopy, we'd pick up an additional 0.6 bushel was our number over a big average. So those are the cases where I'd look at it with that, and you know, otherwise they're not going to see a lot of advantage with fungicide use.
A quick question on white mold. We've had some hot weather, specifically today. Is it too late to spray white mold as we get into the following week?
Yeah, so you know, for clarification, when I said they're not going to see other advantages from that fungicide use, that's really related to like white mold. Some of these stem and root rot diseases that we're talking about, those really, the fungicides aren't going to have an effect on those. So when we're looking at white mold management too, really last week before we had the cool weather, it's going to really take off with that. As we get hotter, like now, this week we're in, it's going to really shut down. But if we do have viewers that have had white mold problems, we're going to want to look at using that, and hopefully maybe they made that application at flowering, which should be more critical than at R3 time.
You can learn more about fungicide applications to soybeans at upcoming Soybean Management Field Days, sponsored by the Nebraska Soybean Board. Those free events take place the second week of August. We'll have more information on locations and topics during next week's episode. Also in soybeans, UNL Extension educator John Wilson says now is a good time to start checking fields for soybean cyst nematodes. Wilson says the cysts are small, lemon-shaped, white to cream-colored, and appear on the outside of the root. He says just because you don't find any cysts when you're scouting, that doesn't necessarily mean your field is free of SCN. A soil sample will provide the most accurate results, and it's free thanks to the Nebraska Soybean Board. Growers can get bags from their local UNL Extension office to begin the process. As of the latest USDA state report, Nebraska's wheat farmers had harvested over half of their crop. Dryland producers were just getting underway in Nebraska's Panhandle when we visited last week. At the Panhandle Research and Extension Center in Scottsbluff, we talked with UNL Extension entomologist Jeff Bradshaw about the wheat stem sawfly. As Jeff said when we spoke, the sawfly has been seen farther east this season and in very high numbers.
Yeah, we saw quite a few wheat stem sawflies this year. I've got a student of mine that was engaged in some studies, doing some survey and documenting movement of wheat stem sawfly this summer. And he had one field site where he collected 15,000 adult wheat stem sawflies over the course of the season starting in May. So,
is there any reason that they've been so prevalent?
Well, I wish I knew the answer to that. We'd probably have better solutions if I knew that answer. But they definitely seem to be spreading, both in intensity and in geographic range.
Male and female, what's the breakdown there in terms of how many egg layers you'll have for the following?
Well, we estimated based on this year's population about 40% of those 15,000 in that one field, for example, about 40% of those should be female. So there's a lot of egg laying capacity. Interesting fact is female sawflies don't have to mate to lay eggs. They can lay what are called haploid individuals, and so once they come out, they just start laying eggs.
Where are you seeing it at in the Panhandle, and how far is it moving east?
We can find wheat stem sawfly infested fields throughout the Panhandle. It generally still tails off as we go east, but this year for the first time we found them in southern Garden County, getting kind of close to the Chapel area.
Are they being pretty detrimental to that wheat?
Yeah, last year, well, so far we don't have really good records for this year, but from last year we had even some seed wheat fields that were experiencing 80% lodging from wheat stem sawfly, which is pretty dramatic. You can, obviously there's yield loss associated with that. Some of the problems associated with lodging are associated with harvest. I mean, you can still pick that weed up, but it can be slow going.
You say you've also noticed it in other grasses as well.
Yeah, so as part of our survey, we've been looking at some other grasses in the area, rye, downy brome, some of our other weedy grass species, and we've got some field locations or near field locations where we found as much as 100% of downy brome infested with wheat stem sawfly. Now it's sort of a dead-end host for the sawfly at this time of the year, but that might be possibly, those could be locations where the parasitoid of the wheat stem sawfly could thrive.
Are there avenues where producers can go here in terms of different wheat varieties or other things they can do in order to control this pest?
Yeah, so we've been screening some wheat varieties here at the station, as well as looking at the state variety plots that Tachomi and Deepak sets up out here. And we found some conventional varieties. Freeman, for example, might show some promise in having some resistance against wheat stem sawfly, which is great. It's a hollow stem and a new commercial variety from NU Genetics. But we also have some conventional traits. Solid stem trait in wheat has been shown to provide some resistance against wheat stem sawfly. And one of the things we've been doing with that variety is trying to test that pith expression across the state to see if it's, that trait's going to be consistent.
In the end, is this the concern that maybe next year the numbers will again be high?
I would expect the numbers to be high again next year. We've been tracking, myself and colleagues at Wyoming and Colorado have been tracking the movement of this insect. And in Colorado this year, they had a new record down in Baca County, which is the southeasternmost county in Colorado, where they found sawflies, basically just adjacent to Oklahoma, to the Oklahoma Panhandle. So the insect is moving south, it's moving east. It doesn't seem to be
slowing down
at all. Yeah.
In related wheat news, for information on planting forages into irrigated wheat stubble, you can view our interview with Aaron Berger from last week's episode of Market Journal. Prescribed burning to benefit grass, control red cedar trees, and improve wildlife habitat is gaining favor across Nebraska. The July Nebraska Farmer lists the 10 local prescribed burn associations now in the state and provides tips on starting an association. Larry Moeller helped form the Elkhorn Valley Prescribed Burn Association that now includes members from 5 counties. He's seeking more diversity in grasses and forbs to increase habitat for birds, pollinators, and butterflies. The July Nebraska Farmer also lists the agencies and private partners that aid landowners in forming an association. On a warm and windy day near North Platte last week, we talked with UNL Extension entomologist Dave Boxler. We've mentioned before how flies can pose an economical threat to cattle by limiting weight gain. Now in midsummer, Dave says it's a good time for farmers and ranchers to reevaluate their fly control methods.
This year, fly numbers started out rather slow because of the cool temperatures in late May and June, but population numbers are increasing rather quickly now, and we're seeing population numbers of horn flies on untreated cattle ranging anywhere from 500 to well over 1,000 per animal. So it's time for producers, I think, to reevaluate their current fly control for the season, maybe make some adjustments if they feel they're not getting the fly control that they need.
What are some simple things that they can do to make sure that they are getting the best that?
Well, I think one of the most important factors is evaluation of what they're using right now. And what they really need to do is go out probably between 8 o'clock in the morning and say 11 before it gets too warm. Look at the animals, look at the sides of the animals, and see if they can estimate the number of flies. A lot of people will go out during the heat of the day and look at their animals and look at the backs of the animals, and they won't see any horn flies. Well, at that time of the day, the flies are down under the belly, so they're not quite as conspicuous. So I would suggest going out in mid-morning and just taking a good look, and if you've got quite a few flies, and especially on a cow-calf situation, if your calves are carrying flies, you've exceeded the economic injury level of 200 flies per animal, and it's time that a treatment, a new treatment or a modification be implemented.
How can it implement, or how can it hinder the growth of the calf?
Well, certainly weaning weights can be impacted anywhere from 10 to 20 pounds in the research that we've done here in Nebraska. So it can be significant. And yearling weights can be affected by as much as 18%.
Tell me about the research you're doing here with these cattle, something with the ear tag in trying to control flies.
Right, we're looking at a new method. It kind of accompanies the old insecticide ear tag, but we're evaluating a new ear tag strip, which can be applied to the backside of an existing identification tag. It slips over the button area of the tag, and so far on this group of heifers, the ear tag strip is staying intact and looks to be extremely durable. So we'll be following this particular strip through the rest of the summer, and we're also going to be looking at another ear tag strip probably in the next week or two.
Finally, Dave, what have you seen so far in grasshopper numbers, and what are your expectations as we move through the rest of summer?
Well, grasshopper numbers in west central Nebraska have been fairly low. I've been in some pastures where I've seen about 6 to 7 per square yard. Now, there's been 2 occasions here in west central Nebraska where a grasshopper treatment was made. It was kind of a special situation, involved in irrigated pasture. And they can be a little bit different because in the fall they are very green and highly attractive to adult grasshoppers for egg deposition. So other than those 2 applications, I haven't heard of any others. And I anticipate grasshopper numbers to remain about where they're at. And I think we've lucked out again this year.
Now, with this week's weather forecast, here's UNL Extension State Climatologist Al Dutcher.
Well, folks, here we again for the weekly forecast. Of course, the hot weather we talked about last week did pretty much come to fruition, although we did get a little bit of a cool down during the middle part of the week, particularly on Wednesday, as the cold front kind of slipped a little bit farther south than was originally forecasted in the models last week. But overall, we are fairly well above normal across a good portion of the state. There was a significant lack of precipitation for most areas. We did see a little bit of a complex movement from northwestern Nebraska all the way through southwest Nebraska during the Wednesday time frame. And we did see some isolated thunderstorm activity that jumped over an inch of precipitation. Unfortunately, it came with hail. And then, of course, as we've seen the warm front moving across the state during the Thursday-Friday time frame, we did touch off some scattered convection. But overall, the trend over the last month has been excessively dry for a good portion of the state. We're looking at broad-based areas of eastern Nebraska and portions of western Nebraska where we received less than 25% of normal precipitation. So in the absence of significant moisture this weekend, we would expect that there will be a significant upgrade to the drought monitor, as it'll go through next Tuesday morning, but it'll be released next Thursday. I would suspect that we'll see a good area of eastern Nebraska and portions of western Nebraska that will be upgraded to abnormally dry conditions. And I think our saving grace at this point in time has been that we haven't been excessively hot. And if the trend continues with cooler temperatures this week, the real question of how this crop's going to fare will come in about 10 days as the heat starts to show signs of returning. So we're going to need to see some of that monsoon moisture start to evect into western Nebraska and translate into eastern Nebraska for us to save the potential for some significant crop decline. So let's take a look at the upper air models and see whether or not those rain chances are in the forecast. I think I'll draw your attention to is the big area of high pressure that was responsible for bringing all the warmth to our region is being pushed farther to the south as we have an upper air low trailing across the Canadian border. And as it moves toward the Great Lakes, it's going to once again dig down southward and start to bring in some of the cooler than normal conditions. And that will happen as we go through this weekend. So the cold front will be moving southward as we progress through the day, giving us a chance for scattered thunderstorm activity across the northern part of the state. Not widespread, but at least there is a chance for moisture. Now as we go into tomorrow, this is going to push that front southward to us, so we could see some convection still in the morning hours tomorrow. but then that will all shift southward into Kansas, and we'll be left with basically much cooler conditions. We're going to drop our temperatures a good 10 degrees across the state, and even cooler conditions are on store as we get into Monday, as we start to see this trough deepening to our east, and that's going to bring that flow in the upper area of the atmosphere from the northwest and bringing that cooler conditions in. So we're going to go right back to those fall-like conditions across the eastern half of the state. Unfortunately, for the western half of the state, we'll be looking at closer to normal conditions for an additional day as we're closer to this ridge of high pressure. But more importantly, we're going to start to see some moisture moving up into the central Rockies on the backside of this high pressure system, which was considered to be our monsoonal flow. And that should intersect with this front and have the possibility of generating some thunderstorm activity across the western part of the state. Some of this might get into the Panhandle on Tuesday, but a much better chance will be on Wednesday as the trough has digged itself out to our east and buttoned up against that moisture. We should see some scattered thunderstorm activity, and some of that will start to make its way into central Nebraska, particularly as we get into Thursday. So by Thursday, you start to see that this trough is relaxing, and some of that moisture will make it into central Nebraska, with a possibility that some of it may actually make it into extreme eastern Nebraska, but it's probably going to be very isolated. Now, as we go into Friday, we'll see that this trough is gradually weakening, and the monsoon moisture is going to pick up and start pushing into the western part of the state, so we're going to continue to carry chances for scattered thunderstorm activity all the way through next weekend. Now, as we go into the temperature forecast, we'll be looking at the warmest temperatures this weekend, and then we'll be cooling down as we go into the midweek period before we start to warm up toward the end of the week. The thunderstorm activity is there, but it's very isolated in nature. 8 to 14-day forecast shows the cool air pushing down toward the south. Notice the warmth starting to come in. In terms of moisture, we show below normal precipitation, but we also showing with the models that increasing monsoonal flow will start to make its way in as we get late into next weekend.
Thanks, Al. Today's interviews on corn and soybean markets, foliar fungicide applications in soybeans, wheat stem sawfly, and evaluating fly control can be found individually on the Market Journal website and through the Market Journal mobile app. Next week, Mike Briggs will be our cattle market analyst, and we'll look at the upcoming soybean management field days. Until then, thanks for watching. I'm Jeff Wilkerson. We'll see you next week.
Join Market Journal online at marketjournal.unl.edu. You can also follow us on Facebook and Twitter. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine. Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Soybean Board. The Soybean Checkoff, growing opportunity from the ground up. Market Journal is produced by the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources. Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Soybean Board.
No matter how you look at it, animal agriculture helps Nebraska's economy. The livestock industry provides increased tax revenues for schools and community services. Livestock enterprises also create jobs while contributing to existing businesses such as local banks and grocery stores. A thriving livestock industry helps maintain our current way of life, but also provides opportunities for the next generation of farm families. The Nebraska Soybean Checkoff helps to raise awareness of the importance of animal agriculture to Nebraska.